Hey, what's up, AP Government people? We are doing Chapter 5 of Government in America today. I'm using the 15th edition, but as always, if you're using another edition, it should match up well for you. This chapter focuses on civil rights and public policy. And we're going to cover a lot of stuff that you probably are familiar with if you took AP US history or really US history in general. A lot of things that will cross over between the two. So let's get started. Politics in action, launching the civil rights movement. Now, when we're talking about civil rights, understand that civil rights are protections of individuals from arbitrary, and that word arbitrary means random, discrimination by government or people. Now, let's talk about debates about equality. Racial and ethnic discrimination. There are debates about how to appropriately deal with this. Is affirmative action an appropriate way? And we'll talk about affirmative action, what that means a little bit later. For gender discrimination, equal rights for women is not guaranteed under the Constitution. There was this failed Equal Rights Amendment. If you take a look at this map here, you will see this was proposed in the 1920s, passed by Congress in 1972, and then not ratified by the states. It fell 3 states shy of the 38 necessary to amend the Constitution and add the Equal Rights Amendment. And age, disability, and sexual orientation is also a form of discrimination that people face as well. So let's talk about the struggle for equality. Equal rights does not translate to equal rewards, and many people favor equality of opportunity. So to make sure that everybody has a chance to succeed, what they do with that opportunity is up to individuals. It's what many Americans and many people believe. As long as there is a level playing field for opportunity, that's what they want to focus on. The Constitution and inequality. Equality is only mentioned in the 14th Amendment. This is such an important amendment for this course. We've talked about it in previous chapters. We'll talk about it in future chapters. And the wording of the 14th Amendment forbids the denial of equal protection of the laws. And this part of the 14th Amendment was introduced by this guy, John Bingham of Ohio. So he is responsible for this wording in the 14th Amendment. Laws that classify people must not be arbitrary or random, so they can't focus on skin color, religion, etc. They can't really go after a specific group of people. However, classifying adults as those 18 and older is okay. So you can classify people based on age, with adult age being 18. You just can't classify people based on skin color, religion, etc. by laws. So let's talk about standards of review. This is what the Supreme Court uses when looking at laws. A reasonable standard of review is easy to meet, and this is acceptable, like restricting the voting age to 18. Inherently suspect means that it's difficult to meet. These laws will not have a good chance of surviving. These are based on race and ethnicity, so these will be deemed invalid, most likely by the Supreme Court. And intermediate scrutiny is the third standard of review the Supreme Court uses, and these are moderately difficult to meet. So the military draft for males only, that is okay, they've allowed that. And it says that this meets a substantial relationship to government purpose. So is there a reason, is there a benefit for the government to classify people based on this, a clear benefit? And according to the Supreme Court for the draft, yes, that is okay. So reasonable standards of review, those laws are okay. Inherently suspect, those laws are going to be thrown out. And intermediate scrutiny is somewhere in between depending on different factors. So the era of slavery, we're going to go back in time to the 1800s. Remember Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. This stated that blacks, whether they were free or slave, had no rights under the Constitution. I do have a video of Dred Scott versus Sanford. You can check on the description below if you want to watch that. The 14th Amendment did lots of things, but one part of that granted citizenship to blacks. So this kind of reversed the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision, which said that blacks are not citizens. After the Civil War, we had the era of Reconstruction and segregation. Jim Crow laws legalized segregation, and segregation existed in the federal government as well, in military, housing, etc. This happened throughout the 20th century as well. The civil rights cases from 1883 stated that private businesses and individuals could discriminate, that the 14th Amendment did not protect minorities from discrimination by private businesses and individuals. And Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 established the idea of separate but equal, that separate facilities based on race are okay as long as they were equal. But when it came to segregation, separate was more of the focus than equal. Rarely, incredibly rarely, if at all, were the facilities ever equal. FDR and Truman in the mid-20th century slowly began to desegregate areas of the government. And we'll talk about that. Equal education. Brown versus Board reversed Plessy's separate but equal doctrine. In 1954, these 9 men on the Supreme Court, and again, I do have a video on the court case Brown versus Board, reversed that idea of separate but equal when it came to education. They stated that all states must desegregate schools with all deliberate speed, and that led to the Little Rock Nine and a whole sort of other issues, but it really began with Brown versus Board in 1954. Brown stated that de jure segregation, or segregation by laws, was illegal. It's illegal for the government to segregate people by laws. De facto segregation is this idea that segregation exists, but not by law. So ethnic and racial groups tend to live in certain parts of cities. Why does that happen? Well, there's social reasons why that happens, and there's economic reasons why that happens, but it's not required by law. De facto segregation is much more hard to combat than is de jure segregation. So the Civil Rights Movement and Public Policy. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which coincidentally, again, I do have a video on. This one is titled The Great Society by LBJ down here. Here he is signing the Civil Rights Act, and notice right behind him is Martin Luther King Jr. This stated that discrimination in public accommodations and employment was illegal, especially in places that did interstate business like hotels, buses, etc. It also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which would investigate different forms of discrimination. And the federal government would cut off funds to state and local governments that practiced discrimination. So it stated it was illegal, and then it tied a penalty to it as well. The Open Housing Act of 1968 made discrimination in housing sales and rentals illegal. Still absolutely true today. Voting rights. When we're talking about voting rights, the 15th Amendment granted suffrage for black males, not females. That doesn't come till later. But the South found ways to get around the 15th Amendment by doing poll taxes, literacy tests, and white primaries, which meant that only white males could vote in political primaries. The 24th Amendment declared that poll taxes were illegal. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 stated that the government could not deny an individual the right to vote based on race or color, and also stated that literacy tests were illegal. So it's not until almost 100 years later that all of these ways that the South was able to get around the 15th Amendment during Reconstruction, that those are finally deemed illegal. And the federal government could also use elections inspectors to make sure that the elections were okay and that nobody was being discriminated against. So let's jump over to other minority groups. Native Americans in 1924, Native Americans became citizens and were granted suffrage. And the Indian Bill of Rights was created, and this basically applies most of the Bill of Rights to Native Americans and their tribes. Some natives have been given certain exemptions through their tribes, such as gambling and taxes, maybe not having to pay sales tax or certain types of taxes. I know New York State, if you are to go to a casino, it is going to be on Native American land. Hispanic Americans make up now in America the largest minority group, and they have used similar tactics as African Americans during that civil rights movement to gain rights. They use things like sit-ins and boycotts. And Cesar Chavez was a very influential Hispanic American who brought attention to the plight of migrant farm workers in the 1960s. And he actually met with RFK and went on a hunger strike to bring attention to migrant farm workers, most of whom were Hispanic. And children of illegal immigrants, according to the Supreme Court in Plyler versus Doe, cannot be denied enrollment in schools. And the Supreme Court argues that denying them enrollment in schools will lead to further social and economic problems down the road. Asian Americans, if you want to watch a video on Korematsu versus the U.S., I have one in the description as well. This deals with the relocation and internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and the Supreme Court upheld that and stated that it was okay to do that during World War II. Again, the theme of American history is during times of crisis or war, individual rights go down. Arab Americans and Muslims have faced discrimination similar to other groups, especially in the post-9/11 world. So let's talk about women in public policy. Coverture means that married women did not have their own identity separate from their husbands. And that has been a big idea in American history. So the battle for the vote, and then the 19th Amendment, which is ratified in 1920, granted suffrage for women. However, many Western states allowed women to vote prior to the 19th Amendment. The Western states, Wyoming, etc., were more democratic for women than Eastern states were. The doldrums, so we're talking about the 1920s to 1960s, the goals of women diverged after the 19th Amendment. We see this women's movement kind of split up into different goals. The Equal Rights Amendment, again proposed in 1923, it was passed by Congress in 1972, but it was never ratified by the states. So the second feminist wave really begins in the 1960s with this woman, Betty Friedan, in her book, The Feminine Mystique, which stated that women were not living fulfilled lives in the 1950s under this idea of the cult of domesticity, that women should stay home and raise their children and be good wives. She was also an instrumental founder of the National Organization of Women, or NOW. And in Craig versus Boren in 1976, this helped set the standard for gender discrimination. Again, going back to the idea of the intermediate that we talked about earlier. Women in the workplace, the Civil Rights of 1964 banned gender discrimination in work, and Title IX outlawed gender discrimination in education. And this applies to athletics as well. And few things have done as much for women's sports in both high schools and colleges as Title IX. It provides lots of funding for equal opportunity for men and women in education. So wage discrimination and comparable worth. Even today, women earn less than men for comparable jobs. When we're talking about sexual harassment, this was deemed a form of gender discrimination by the Supreme Court in 1986. And employees are safe from retaliation by employers if they file a claim. So there are some ways to protect employees who do file a sexual harassment claim. There are protections for them. Women in the military, for a long time, women served in units that were separate for men, and they're not required to register for the draft when they turn 18, as are men. They are prohibited from serving in combat, but they do play very important roles, one of them being pilots. However, there are plans to change combat restrictions by 2016. So in the next year and a half, we should see women playing a more larger role in combat. So the Civil Rights and the Grain of America, will jump to the Age Discrimination Act in 1975, stated that federal funds would be denied to institutions that engaged in discrimination against people over 40. Most jobs cannot require forced retirement unless employers can show age and ability are related. So if you can show that the older you are, that your ability to do your job significantly decreases, then in those cases only can you possibly force somebody to retire early. And this is going to be more and more of an issue as these baby boomers, the largest part of the population, are becoming of retirement age. When we're talking about people with disabilities, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 stated that those with disabilities were protected from discrimination. And the number one thing you should think of with the people with disabilities is Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, signed in 1990 by George H.W. Bush, and you see him here. Public facilities must make reasonable accommodations and prevent discrimination in the workplace. Think back for a moment. I think it was chapter 2, maybe 1. What type of mandate was the Americans with Disability Act? It was an unfunded mandate because the federal government required the states and local governments and businesses to meet this need, but they did not provide funding for it. Gay and lesbian rights, a lot of this goes back to the Stonewall riots in 1969, and here's a map of where the Stonewall Inn was located. And this was a bar that many patrons were gay and would be harassed and arrested by the police. One night, the patrons had enough, and they basically had a riot in the streets. This launches the gay rights movement. In 1998, I remember I was a sophomore in high school, and the case of Matthew Shepard happened. He was a gay man who was brutally attacked and ended up being killed. He was dragged behind a truck and was killed simply because he was gay. And this helped bring a lot of attention to the plight of homosexuals. The Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was repealed by Obama in 2010 in the military. The Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy goes back to Bill Clinton, this idea that nobody would ask what sexual orientation an individual was, and as long as gays didn't openly tell that they were gay, they could serve in the military. Affirmative action, let's go to Executive Order 11246, was passed by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965. This banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in federal contractors. And employers must have goals to increase the number of women and minorities in their workforce. So this dives into what exactly is affirmative action. The goal of affirmative action is to increase employment, opportunities, and protection for groups that have been discriminated against. So, for example, African Americans and women. The hope is to move from equal opportunity to equal results. Now, an example of affirmative action, of a case that is often associated with affirmative action, is the Regents of University of California versus Bach. UC Davis, University of California Davis, had a quota for 100 applicants that they would accept. 16 of them would be reserved for disadvantaged groups like minorities and women. This was declared unconstitutional. Bach was a white male who sued, saying that unfairly targeted him. So the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. However, they did say that race could be used as part of the admission process, just not solely the admission process. Affirmative action is a highly debated topic, and over the years the court has made different interpretations of how the government. Civil rights and democracy, essentially rights and liberties, have pushed for reforms in America. The First Amendment, not really suffrage, has helped African Americans and women. So this idea of people speaking out has had more of an impact than the right to vote. When it comes to civil rights in the scope of government, civil rights usually increases the size and power of the government. And some examples look at post-Civil War, the 13th through 15th Amendments. And in the civil rights of the 1950s and 60s, you have the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, which increases the size of the government as well. All right, let's do a quick recap. The 14th Amendment granted equality and citizenship for African Americans. Know the standards of review, the reasonable, inherently suspect, and intermediate scrutiny. Brown versus Board of Education reversed Plessy versus Ferguson in the doctrine of separate but equal. De jure versus de facto segregation, be familiar with. Definitely also know the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the 24th Amendment, what each of those did. Title IX increased funding for women both in education and athletics, and the Americans with Disabilities Act was a milestone act for Americans with disabilities. And Regents of the University of California versus Bach. Be familiar with all of these terms here. All right, thank you guys very much for watching. I'm going to ask you if you have not already, please subscribe to my channel. Help spread the word. If you found this video helpful, please let other people know in your class, your teachers, anybody. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the section below. And if you want to know what the deal is with President Johnson here, I have a video in my description. If you want to know what the deal is with Lyndon Johnson here, and he's doing what is known as the Johnson treatment, watch the video in the description called The Presidency of Lyndon Johnson, and you will see me doing the Johnson treatment to something as well. Thank you guys for watching. Have a good day.